Welcome back. It may not look like it, but we are on the cusp of a technological boom so large that it rivals the pre to post sapling transition period of this run. EV, tungsten steel, and IV processing unlock a huge number of multi-block machines, and those machines, unlike the single-block versions, scale their processing up as a function of how much power you give them, whereas single blocks simply suffer from crippling efficiency losses at higher tiers with no benefit whatsoever. In layman's terms, crafting speed go up. Which would be fantastic if, every time my auto-crafting system lost power, I didn't suddenly switch to slideshow mode from the several million XP orbs trying to exist without my permission. The rain part of this losing power problem I can solve with a Terra Bozu being automatically fed sunflowers by a dynamism tablet. I'm not entirely certain what I could do about the nighttime part of the problem other than moving to a different dimension, which is an option but is not one that's super appealing given how much time it would take. I hate rain, so I'd make sure that I stock up on a few more stacks of sunflowers to auto-feed the Bozu with. No, not those are the spares. I'm talking about this barrel of sunflowers here. If it rains sometime before the heat death of the universe, I'm going to be quite unhappy. Before I can get started with the great expansion, I have to do my chores first. It is clear to me at this point that any non-bee based mob farm is going to be woefully incapable of doing anything other than being ugly and taking up space at this point. And I do not need assistance with either of those things, so it's time for them to go. Unfortunately for me, some idiot decided to make this thing out of warded obsidian, so in addition to removing a bunch of cladding, I have to unward and then manually break the entire farm down by hand rather than just blowing it up or something. Kinda wish I had stupidly overpowered efficiency enchantments right now, not gonna lie. It also turns out that I'm not crazy. I have video proof of me building Schrodinger's kitty bed that shows I used spruce log and wool microblocks, and that is very much not what these microblocks are made out of on this corner here. Have a fish, Schrodinger, and leave the goose-juice magic and world corruption to me. My first expansion phase is, sort of, the automation of my infusion setup. Well, the Essentia part of it, at least. ME systems are capable of moving just about everything, and Essentia is no exception to this rule. Even better, the addition of an infusion interceptor alongside the Essentia provider does some fun fantastical things to Thaumcraft's code that massively speed up the several minute process it takes for an infusion altar to suck all the good juice out of the surrounding jars. It's not what I would consider a good automation setup by any means, but it works well enough as a proof of concept, and I can expand on it later if I need to. It also requires Essentia cells to store Essentia in the ME. I'm not quite certain how many different kinds of Essentia there are in this mod pack, but my working theory is that it's less than 72, so I make 6 cells and then just start packing them up. I don't really have any projects going at the moment, so I will just come along every once in a while and throw some stuff into the system as I need it with my single soul lonely alchemical furnace, and that will be good enough. To give that system a test, I go ahead and enchant my armor with Hazmat. This is a custom Gregtech thing that turns any armor with enchantment into a hazmat suit, and it is unbelievably useful for us magic-loving types who want to wear all the fancy armor we slaved away on for literal days, without also soaking up more rads than a sponge at Chernobyl, or turning our lungs black from inhaling pollution all day. With all that out of the way, let's get down to business. I last left off with goose-juice magic a good 4 episodes ago now, and other than being useful for bee breeding, it hasn't really contributed much to justify its extra price tag. Let's change that. The first step to serious business is, as is typical for magic mods, summoning a demon and then promptly murdering it for its whatever. At this point, I kinda suspect that I am the actual monster in this interaction, because for all I can tell, these demons are mostly just chilling out in their own home dimension, until I violently intrude onto their reality, kidnap their civilians to use as ritual sacrifices, and then promptly leave. Though actually, when I put it that way, it's less that I'm a bad guy and more that I'm just kind of a Lovecraftian plot point. So, the things you learn when you're writing a video script. The next step requires collecting a bunch of random junk, and one of these pieces of random junk happens to be a bit of firestone dust, which I am maybe possibly kind of a teeny tiny bit entirely out of. The only way I can get it is by breeding sulfur bees and satisfying their jubilance requirements to get the firestone comb secondary. So I get on that. Since I already had clay, peat, and coal drones, breeding up sulfur and producing firestone only takes me about an hour, because that's Gregtech, baby. Firestone, the items at least, have this wonderful property of maybe just a little bit setting everything on fire when you hold it. I forgot that. I'm not entirely certain how none of my machines exploded from this random fire mechanic, or even if they can, because as a general rule, I don't try to blow up machines all that often, but I'm just thankful that all that happened here was a little bit of a panic attack. An explosion in the plat line could have been quite expensive and humiliating to fix up. With all my materials put together and my base extinguished, I can now craft myself something called an activation crystal, which is the goose-juice magic version of a wand, or a witch's hand, insomuch as it is used to activate rituals. Well, ritual, singular. There's really only one ritual that I care about here. This ritual, for reasons that will soon become apparent, requires a whole lot of space to be used effectively. It doesn't have to be lit space, per se, or really special in any way. I just need a 64-block cube of the stuff. My chosen location for this project is on the far side of my base, where the Mega EBF used to be, largely because I want it at least somewhat close to everything else without also taking up space on the long edge where I keep putting my mob farms. The most infuriating part about this process is that it happens to be an odd-axis symmetrical multi-block. Like most things in the game, it focuses on a single functional block in the center of the ritual, and as such, the whole thing does not jive at all with my even symmetry base design and the even symmetry of chunk borders. This bothers me, but it is entirely unavoidable unless for some reason I wanted to make 4 of the things, which is hilarious but also pointless, so I will learn to live with it. I even take the time to spruce up the area a little bit with some embossing patterns on the floor. That, if nothing else, should give people a pretty dang good idea of why I don't bother decorating my base. This stuff takes forever. So, what is my lovely expensive blue mandala ritual actually good for? Well, as we all know, Minecraftian space is actually full of nothing but extremely large blobs of litter that, by sheer chance, are composed of different kinds of ore blocks. As an environmentally conscious and reasonable person, I feel that I need to do my part in ensuring the health and safety of my fellow Minecraftians, and as such have taken on the arduous responsibility of applying the big suck to the upper atmosphere in order to filter out those pesky little blobs of raw material, using a magical vacuum cleaner powered by the juiced remains of my mortal enemies. The fact that I can use these ores to further my own technological progression is, of course, entirely accidental. It also very quickly becomes apparent that I do not have a snowball's chance of mining this thing by hand. That's okay though, because I have other options. Introducing the auto miner. It mines automatically. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's not all that special. Feeding it mining pipes and power will result it digging down and pooping up ores. Of course, it also turns out that you can't disable the auto backfill mechanic with the single block version. So I learned something new today, but it does mean that this thing is entirely pointless. And I will have to mine this giant ball of ore by hand. Boy, I wonder how I'm ever going to get around that problem. But before all that, mallet time. As any veteran of automation games will tell you, the first thing that you should automate is the stuff you need to make more automation, which in my case means I need to get my energy situation figured out. The first step is a dedicated fuel processing setup, read fluid extractor and distillery. Wood tar distills into three materials that can be fed into gas turbines directly. At the moment, I'm only going to use benzene, but I'm probably going to end up burning all of them, depending on whether I need them for other things. Like explosives. And that's pretty much it. Getting the system wired up to the charcoal supply and reconfiguring my network for fluids honestly took longer than getting this thing built. I gotta say, I do kind of like gas turbine setups for that. They are dirt simple to automate. Better yet, since this thing is feeding fluid directly into my ME network, I can start pulling out all the fuel lines and replacing them with ME cabling, which is something I'm going to need to start laying down anyway. A little bit of benzene to start it up, and I now have zero questions asked scalable fuel production for the rest of EV and IV. Just, as long as I keep murdering zombies on an industrial scale. Now that I, in principle, have access to unlimited benzene, I need to convert that into much more limited amounts of electricity. This means it's time for gas turbines. Despite being cheaper than the alternatives, they are still quite expensive at the moment, so I want to make sure they are as compactly placed as possible. The design I go with stacks two of them horizontally and leaves me room to expand upwards as much as I want, until I hit the roof, that is. I would have loved to have been able to pack them tighter, but each of the systems needs its own individual fuel supply, maintenance hatch, and muffler hatch, which kind of precludes me from just building a solid brick of the things. Either way, they're cheap and they go together pretty easily, so no complaints here. It isn't all sunshine and roses, though. Unlike their single block variants, multi-block gas turbines are always running, even if the power they produce is being entirely wasted. If I had a tighter control over my production lines, I might be willing to overlook this loss in fuel, but as it is, my systems are very much not designed for constant power draw, and this unfortunate fact would very quickly lead to titanic amounts of fuel being turned into an equally titanic amount of pollution for no benefit whatsoever. I hemmed and hawed and thought about it for a bit, and the quickest and most reliable solution I could come up with was to just run all my energy through a 16 amp battery buffer full of crystals and use some redstone covers to measure how much power is stored. If that charger ever drops below like 50%-ish or something, the fuel will start being fed back into the turbines and on they will turn. I still end up losing efficiency in the spin up and spin down process here, but at least I won't be running the whole bank of them at full blast to supply power to a single LV macerator running overnight, which is what would have happened otherwise. Of course, even with that done, there is one more shocking twist that nobody saw coming. Amazingly, this one single MV fluid extractor is not enough to keep up with the benzene demands of 4 EV tier multi-blocks. Truthfully, neither is the distillery tower at this point, but I can just add more energy to that and that'll solve the problem there. I sure wonder if there's an obsolete system that I can steal a bunch of fluid extractors from to help out with this terrible catastrophe. Yeah, so the solution here is just to swap the extraction systems around. The legacy biofuel stuff can run off of the MV extractor while I phase it out, and the new system gets the full bank of extractors. I'm close to having a multi-block that can do extraction for me, but it's an IV tier build, and I do not have the infrastructure I need to produce the parts for it yet. Embarrassingly enough, even that is not enough to keep up. I have to overclock my distillation tower to EV, and even then we'll have to tack on some more fluid extractors before the thing is even capable of pretending to supply enough power. I'm not sure if my memory is worse or if these things used to be better, but either way, this is kind of what I get for not doing the math beforehand. Numeric challenges aside, I now have access to pretty much an unlimited 4 amp supply of EV power that can sort of be easily upgraded to start burning through a considerable reserve of fuel if I ever need more. So power is solved enough for now. Next up is the EBF. Basically nothing here changes other than I'm dumping 4 times the amount of power into it, so I get over that problem pretty quickly and move on. I am now the proud owner of a chest and a half of random ore, courtesy of my mining setup. Some of them are useful, but the overwhelming majority of them aren't, so I'm going to have to cherry pick which ones I want to start processing. Since it's clear to me that the crud ball needs to disappear, I get started on crud cleanup. The first step in this process is naturally picking a bunch of flowers. These flowers are, of course, for Botania. Botania is a little bit different in New Horizons, and compared to what you may be used to if you played it in another mod pack, my mana generation options are seriously limited here. After I go through and eliminate all of the joke, passive, unautomatable, and uncraftable flower options, there's really only 5 that are even remotely useful. Thermalilies consume lava, and interpinions require exploding TNT. Both of these are doable conditions to meet, but neither of them consume substances I really want to automate, and specifically in the case of TNT, I don't really want to risk working with it. Munchdews would require a tree farm, which is fine, but kind of majorly inconvenient. And while this world might be the only time an Arslimnus could even be realistically used at all, I don't particularly feel like making a slime farm. Which leaves me stuck with the Gormarillus, a flower that consumes food to generate a fairly respectable amount of mana. Gormies have their own problems, though. Unlike my go-to option of an Endoflame, which I can't get because they require nether flowers, one Gormy will happily consume all of the food you throw on the ground for a bunch of them before the others get a chance to eat, which means I have to wire them up and space them out, stocking up individual dispensers for each flower. It also means I have to feed the things, which for large-scale automatable processes can get a little bit tricky. Fishing ports are one way of solving the food problem with Gregtech, but I just opt to repurpose some of my auto farm space that was previously producing peanuts and hook the outputs up from that to some automatic crafting. My food of choice is vegetable stew because of its relatively high nutritional value and the fact that it can be crafted entirely with 3 ingredients that are farmable, but there are a ton of other good options if you want to go this route. Also, I know these world interaction upgrade crafters get some shade, but honestly they really are not so bad once you get a couple of speed upgrades in them. Like, I will fully admit they are not ideal for bucket crafting and they are not super competitive, but if you have to use them, they don't cost energy, they don't jam up exactly, and they have a pretty decent output rate, so they're not a terrible alternative. In order to do much of anything in Botania, I need to craft myself some runes. I opt to make a few of each type, and also split out half a stack for each variety I need for the Gormies. Runes aren't individually particularly expensive, but they do take quite a lot of time because of how slow my mana logistics is. With these runes crafted, I can then immediately turn around and use a bunch of them as part of the 24 items needed to craft the Terrasteel agglomeration plate. This recipe is a little bit much, admittedly, and my infusion altar looks stupid now, but really it is not all that bad in the grand scheme of things. Like most magic mods in this pack, crafting usually isn't materially expensive in so much as it's just very fiddly and time consuming. I also made enough runes here for half a stack of Gormies, and in any other Botania version this would be a pointlessly large amount of mana production, and useful only for things like bulk alchemization or maxing out a Terra Shatterer, which means it might be a decent starting point. Botania gets put on pause for a little bit as I take the time to install another couple of gas turbines. My EBF consumes all of my current output when it's running, which limits my ability to produce fuel, and could potentially stall out the system if I ran it for long enough. My solution here is just make more electricity, which will still stall out the system, but it'll stall it out because I run out of benzene instead of electricity, and I have several thousand buckets of benzene in my ME as a buffer, so that sounds like a problem for another day. Well, another day when I have a solution that isn't just spamming more fluid extractors. I'm not even scraping the surface on the amount of charcoal that I'm producing right now, by the way. This limitation is strictly a processing problem. With my EBF production saved, for now, the Gormies I make can then be stuck under dispensers, cross-hatched with item logistics and redstone, and delivered soup. I don't quite know how much mana they produce in terms of mana spreader requirements, because by this point in a normal run I usually already have endgame mana production, and just sort of over-engineer the heck out of my logistics part of it. So I opted to be cautious and go with one spreader for every 4 flowers, with each spreader feeding into its own pool, which I can then use to transmit mana via sparks. The portal to Alfheim is not going to be happening for a bit, if ever, since it requires steel leaf, which means that I would have to spend another 3 hours messing around in industrial craft crop breeding. And since all of the good mana management tools are gated behind that portal, I'm going to have to rely on quantity rather than quality for anything that I do with Botania. That's fine, I guess. Computers and space heaters are famously known to be entirely interchangeable, so I'd prefer to think of it as like an opportunity to get a 2-for-1 deal. This whole process nets me the mana logistics necessary to process my first little bit of Terra Steel, a material that, in addition to being required for the Terra Shatterer, also happens to double as an excellent tinker tool and rotor making material if you're ever looking for one of those. It is actually much better than shadow metal in pretty much every respect, but shadow metal is so cheap that I'm probably going to keep using it for a little while still. With that progression out of the way, making a Terra Steel pickaxe is fairly trivial. Cool. All that was the easy part. Now I just have to dump 1,000 pools of mana into the thing, plus whatever the enchanting process takes. In order to get my enchantment stacking loop going, I need an over-enchanter, a disenchanter, and a mana enchanter. The mana enchanter is easy, and I slam it in without any issues whatsoever. The over-enchanter I already have, but the disenchanter needs amethyst, which requires me to clean up my mess over at the meteor summoning site and conduct another ritual to get amethyst ore. Fortunately for me, though, I can regularly enchant my Shatterer just fine. As long as I don't over-enchant it, I can wipe the enchantments off of it and redo it later, and this gives me a decent 5x5 mining AoE from the mana upgrades, along with efficiency 5. This is at least enough to get rid of the basalt poo ball in the sky without giving me flashbacks to digging out dirt creeper balls, but it's certainly not good by any respect. And here comes the money ball. Yeah, that seems like enough amethyst to me. And with a little bit more crafting, there we go. 1 disenchanter. I've already made my efficiency 6 seed pickaxe, say that 5 times fast, and I happen to have a whip of destruction that I can pull the sharpness and unbreaking off of. I'm not entirely certain if unbreaking even matters, given that the Terra Shatterer is supposed to consume mana instead of durability, but it's pretty much free, so I may as well put it on. Efficiency and unbreaking are much less expensive to apply than fortune, so the mana costs end up being quite reasonable, even taking into account the quadratic growth rate. And yes, earlier I said exponential. I am aware of the difference, I just can't do math, so I'm not entirely certain what you expected. I did some testing, and it seems like efficiency 20 is more than enough to insta-mine ore, so I stack myself a book up to efficiency 19, apply it to the pickaxe along with unbreaking 10, and over-enchant the Shatterer. While that's running, I also noticed something else rather interesting. Unlike most items, my mana rings have a durability bar. The cheese reflex being what it is, I immediately have to have a pop over and check to see if it works with Atomic Repairer, and the answer is sort of. It goes in and consumes Essentia, but it doesn't actually repair the ring itself, so it's kind of a wash. But wait, I say to myself, what about Void Putty? Because that works in a different way. So naturally I test that, I spawn myself a piece of it in, and cool. Each of these rings is 2 pools of mana, by the way. And I don't personally need more mana right now, but, you know, stabilized rifts aren't all that complicated to get, so maybe I should start looking into mass production of luniums or something. Of course, I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't give the pickaxe a spin, so I pull down another meteor and start cranking on it. Shockingly, the pickaxe does exactly what it says on the tin, so yeah. Who needs mining drills when you could just do this? Now that I am equipped with more ore than I could possibly handle at the moment, now what? Well, many things, as it so happens, though most of them are going to be happening simultaneously throughout the base and are going to kind of be a pain to document. It is time to start centralizing my power, for one, so I am going to bring over the nuclear reactor and plug it into the central power line. I want nuclear reactors running more than my turbines at the moment, so there's really no reason to not have this thing helping out. It also means that I need to finally, start fueling it, which is basically just slamming a bunch of uranium into some metal tubes and calling it a day. This thing, I will reiterate, is not super complicated to operate. Ore processing in this mod involves four main machines: a macerator, a centrifuge, a thermal centrifuge, and a sifting machine. And basically all ore that I'm going to want to process uses at least two of these at some stage or another. I already have the sifting machine made. It's currently quite happily sitting in my plat line, but the other three are all on my list. Unfortunately, they all require different kinds of random alloy to make, and most of those alloys need blast furnace time, which means the real effect of starting all these projects up is to just stack up a bunch of junk in the blast furnace queue, which I'm already waiting on. Oh, and for those who are wondering, yes, I checked. Warded glass does block nuclear explosions. I was pretty sure it did before, but, better safe than sorry. Since I can't really queue up any more smeltables with the EBF, I find other things to do with my time. I have quite an assortment of ore at my disposal now, which means that it's time to start collecting some more exotic material. Zirconium is sourced from tin ore and is needed for something called an alloy blast furnace, which is basically just a regular blast furnace, but it uses less power and produces liquid metal instead of hot ingots of metal. Nickel is also a decent source of cobalt and platinum metallic powder, and I will need a bunch of both of those to proceed in the future. The blast AoE from these meteors is so large that I actually have to put Schrodinger in their kitty kennel, otherwise known as a soul vial, otherwise they risk being caught up in the shockwave, but rest assured that kitty will return once the sky stops falling. This AoE is so unbelievably large that it manages to tickle the owls I had sitting in their roosts nearly 8 chunks away. These suckers are huge. The more ore plan is going great until the ME system overflows. Twice. To be quite honest, this thing has been on its last legs for a while, and I've just kept stringing it along until I was at a decent point to upgrade it. I guess now is as good as ever? My upgrades are designed to handle 3 specific deficiencies with the system. The first is that it looks like dog water. My solution to this is just to hide all the ugly bits, so I don't have to look at them. Real high quality engineering right there. The second problem is that there's no more room in the system. Well, 30 more 64K storage cells handles that problem quite nicely. The third problem is a lack of channels, and after more experimentation that I can admit without being embarrassed, I just kind of threw up my hands, said heck with it, and over-engineered the living daylights out of it. The design I ended up with is this weird cross shape that gives me a bunch of controller surface area to slam peer-to-peer tunnels on, and I will admit I have no idea if it's good or not. It works, though, so I guess it's good enough. I also decided that I'm going to start running all of my network cable inside the factory floor to clear up space in the cable run for, actual cabling and piping and stuff. So if you're curious about what all the color-coded lines on the floor are, those mark different cable traces that I can tie into. This whole upgrade process also cost me somewhere in the ballpark of 14 stacks of MV circuits. That bit previously where I made 32 stacks of the things as a joke, yeah, that was not a joke. That was me being entirely serious in trying to estimate how many of the things I need. There is still a fair bit of jank with the new system, largely because I'm tying it into the ad hoc nonsense that I ran as a temporary fix. But as my new base layout begins to finalize itself, I do expect most of that to go away. Plus, as an added bonus, the new ME system only consumes 2 amps of HV power. Constantly. just to keep the thing online. It's a good thing I have power to spare. My first new multi-block is a maceration stack. It processes more ores the more power you give it. Unlike the Steam version, this one also gives you the secondary yields, which are sometimes actually more important than the ore itself. I think it's safe to say that this one is not going to be turning off for quite a while. I'm also going to integrate it with the ME system to handle importing and exporting, but I will spare you the dubious pleasure of watching me fail to network something for half an hour in favor of not making myself look like an idiot on the internet. Graceful ME automation has never been a strong point of mine, and networking in general is something that I'm poor at in every interpretation of the word. Up next is the centrifuge. A centrifuge goes wee very, very, very quickly, and I'm going to be getting a great deal of use out of it, and that's all that you really need to hear about it. Gone are the days of needing 8 centrifuges running in parallel. This sucker will do it all for the low, low price of way too much energy and way too much pollution. While I'm automating random things, let's also get hydrogen set up. A few tiers too late, but better late than never. I am a little ways off from a multi-block electrolyzer, but the single block setup should be more than sufficient, even considering my already excessive consumption of hydrochloric acid thus far. Essentially, all I need to do is feed in a hydrogen-rich fluid in the top tank. I chose to use dimethylbenzene because I have way too much of the stuff, and then after a little bit, out comes hydrogen and carbon powder. I can then dump the powder in with item returns for the oxygen setup, and the hydrogen can just be automatically pumped in and throttled the same way I do with every other fluid. While I'm at it, I also automate some acetic acid and acetone. Since I haven't done anything with oil yet, my normal sources of acetone aren't super practical to set up, but I have basically infinite hydrogen, oxygen, and energy, so I can just brute force the problem using chemistry. My factory floor is, at this point, a riot of colors. They all code for different parts of the ME and subnets within the ME network, and I am never, ever going to attempt to explain how any of it works because nuclear spaghetti has nothing on my network logistics. But, as of yet, I've not needed to use a single dense network cable, so that's a win in my book. Getting the parts I need for an ore washer ends up taking substantially longer than the first two, largely because Grisium takes so dang long to smelt and cool down. So I decide to take a break and do some experimentation. Now that I'm going to be using more than a trickle of power, my multi-block machines are going to start experiencing fairly regular maintenance issues, and I want an automatic way of taking care of them. Which is not something I'm really supposed to have yet. Hatches that are capable of automatically repairing themselves do exist, but they are way too advanced for me to craft right now, and even if I could craft them, they charge an absurd amount each time they repair themselves, so no thank you. From some early experiments, I know that dynamism tablets with duct tape are able to use the tape on maintenance hatches, but dynamism tablets break when the world's reloaded, and you have to reset their inventory to fix that, which kind of defeats the purpose. And they also use duct tape constantly, even when no repairs are made, which even more so defeats the purpose. There is a cover you can attach to multi-block controllers that emits a signal when the device needs to be repaired, and this, combined with some redstone-sensitive item delivery systems, like, a dropper, gets around that particular problem, but it opens up a new one. Quite a lot of multi-blocks have their controllers in spots where there is no way I can put a cover on them. I could use a wireless version and put down a receiver, but doing that requires 4 EV circuits per machine, which is a price point I think I'm willing to pass on. For now though, at least, I will content myself with being able to automate at least some of my repair work, and continue on in the next episode. Interestingly enough, it is against the YouTube terms of service to use dynamism tablets on the engagement buttons down below, so us aspiring system engineers have to rely on crowdsourcing labor for those individuals who are inclined. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.